Now, if we get into the symptoms, how do we recognize it? So what are some of the early things that can show up in terms of this deficit? So some simple things to pay attention to. One is a swollen tongue. And we'll also see that the tongue not just be swollen or enlarged, but we'll see a magenta color. So that tongue will start to look more red and beefy almost. So folate can contribute to that, as can other B vitamins, but again, it's what we're looking for. It's very rare, by the way, that folate deficiency does not occur in a vacuum. It's usually present with other B vitamin deficiencies, especially vitamin B2, B6, and B12. Very common for these to manifest simultaneously and together. Cracks in the mouth, otherwise known as angular stomatitis, is where you get those deep fissures, cracks in the corners of the mouth. Mouth ulcers can be caused by folate deficiency. Early onset depression. So there's a lot to be said. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Forgetfulness, it can cause brain fog, forgetfulness. Folate deficiency can cause diarrhea. We see this very commonly in people going through chemotherapy. One of the effects of chemo is an inhibition of folate, and so the GI tract will start to break down, leading to or trending toward diarrhea as a symptom. We know that folate also plays a role in nerve health, and so numbness or tingling, and this is typically in the hands and in the feet, where this can occur, what would sometimes be referred to as peripheral neuropathy. So again, folate can play a role in that as well. Poor memory is part of this here, kind of the correlation, brain fog, if you will, and confusion. It can get bad. Folate's linked also late-stage confusion, sometimes referred to as dementia. And then insomnia, or inability to sleep well, and so a huge impact on your sleep. So again, earlier warnings. Maybe you have some numbness or tingling in your hands. Maybe you are struggling with loose bowels and your memory's slipping. You can't remember where you put your keys. You're feeling depressed more frequently, and your mouth and your tongue are basically symptomatic and in pain, because this swelling can also lead to kind of a burning sensation. And you're like, why is this happening? Why are these types of things happening? Think folate. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the reasons why. So some of the functions of folate as it relates to why these things happen. Okay, so this first slide that we're going to pull up here is about folate and its ability to help you produce neurotransmitters. So if we look here, neurotransmitters. So the methylation neurotransmitter and antioxidant connections between folate and depression. So if you look here in this research study, our published paper, folate deficiency is also relatively common in depressed people, with approximately 1/3 of depressed individuals, that's 1/3 here, having an outright deficiency. Folate is a water-soluble B vitamin necessary for the proper biosynthesis of monoamine neurotransmitters. What does that mean? That means it helps you make serotonin, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, as well as dopamine. Now, think about it like this. A lot of doctors will use SSRI, which is a type of class of medication, drugs like Paxil or Prozac. These medicines, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are used very commonly to treat depression. Now, part of the theory, although this has been debunked, but historically part of that theory was that the SSRIs preserved serotonin, and that was the mechanism of action of how they actually worked. Although that's been disproven, it is an important note to say that folate deficiency through serotonin can contribute to depression. And so if you look here in this diagram, what I'm trying to show you in this complicated looking diagram, if you see this right here, that's folate. It's a type of folate called 5-formyl tetrahydrofolate. But this pathway leads to the ability for a person to be able to produce serotonin. So if you don't have adequate folate, then it's very hard or more complex for your body to be able to convert tryptophan into serotonin. Remember, tryptophan is an amino acid derived from the consumption of protein, and it's a precursor to making serotonin, but to do this requires folate. And if you don't have adequate folate, your body loses its efficiency at serotonin production. We see the same thing can occur here for dopamine production. And again, dopamine is one of those hormones that makes us feel happy. It makes us feel satisfied or complete. And so if you have a lack of folate, your ability to make serotonin and dopamine is going to be diminished. A lot of doctors will use different classes of medications or antidepressants to try to treat this with this in mind as the mechanism of action. And what research has actually shown over time is that folate should be actually one of the things being used. Folate for actually the treatment of depression. There have been a number of studies showing this where folate was more effective or folate was extremely effective in the treatment of depression. Now in this study, this is a review published, you can see folate and its significance in depressive disorders and suicidality. And you see here mechanisms of homocysteine-induced neurotoxicity. This is what these authors of this research study are trying to basically illustrate. As I mentioned earlier, homocysteine causes vascular damage. I showed you a picture of a blood vessel, but homocysteine also causes nerve damage. And this is nerve damage both to general nerves but also brain tissue. So we have homocysteine is neurotoxic. So it can damage nerves, it can damage the brain, and that's what this is trying to illustrate. As you've got here, you've got hyperhomocysteinemia. This is high levels of homocysteine in the blood, right, leading to several different things that can lead to neurotoxicity. So you've got, in one scenario, you've got what's called impaired methylation. The inability or the reduced ability to make DNA to produce myelin, which is the coating that surrounds your nerves, but also to produce the membrane phospholipids. These are the specialized types of fats that protect the cells. And then also to produce receptors, neurotransmitters, as I just showed you. And then we come to this middle here where you have a neuroexcitotoxicity. And then you have here on this side, you have hyperhomocysteine causing ROS, reactive oxygen species. So oxidative stress, this is when people refer to or use the word, if you've ever heard this term, free radicals, that's what this is in reference to. This oxidative stress is basically free radicals, which can damage nerves. And then you also have endothelial damage. Now, that's what I was showing you earlier with the blood vessel, right? So you had the blood vessel that had damage to the lining. That damage can impact blood flow, leading to reduced blood flow to the central nervous system, also referred to as hypoxia, or reduced blood flow, or really technically reduced oxygen. So it reduces the capacity to deliver oxygen to the brain, which can lead again to a neurotoxic reaction in the brain. So this is how high homocysteine caused by folate deficiency. So if we come back over here, low folate leads to elevated homocysteine, which can damage nerves, can damage brain tissue through multiple different mechanisms. And so, again, up here, you can see folate deficiency here. There are also genetic factors. A lot of you are probably going to be asking about this MTHFR mutation. Individuals with severe MTHFR mutations are at greater risk for folate deficiency, especially if you're taking or using food products with folic acid in them. Now, if you have MTHFR mutation, that doesn't mean you need to take supplemental folate for the rest of your life every day. But what it does mean is if you're eating processed food products that contain this synthetic folic acid, remember we were talking about that earlier, What happens when you take folic acid? You have to convert it into methylfolate. Okay, and if you have an MTHFR mutation, you don't do that very well. So if you bombard yourself with the synthetic type of folic acid, you're going to have a buildup of synthetic folic acid, which can also contribute to, it's been linked to and suspected to contribute to different types of cancers and other problems with inflammation. So it's one of those things, if you have MTHFR, you absolutely want to make sure you're getting any kind of folic acid out of your diet. And if you're going to supplement, you want to use a methylated version of folate. So methylfolate would be a superior option. Methylfolate is what we find in real whole food. Again, real food, not processed food that have synthetic folic acid added to them. So keep that in mind. If you have a mutation, avoid folic acid. Now, a lot of you may be taking certain types of medications that interfere with folate. A classic example of that is, let me draw you another picture here. Let's make some room. If you have rheumatoid arthritis, RA, or other types of inflammatory arthritis, one of the common prescription drugs that gets put out is a drug called methotrexate. Now, methotrexate blocks folate, and so oftentimes the rheumatologist will put the patient who's taking methotrexate on synthetic folic acid in an attempt to overcome this drug-induced side effect. Again, it's very important if you're one of those individuals and you have this MTHFR mutation, folic acid's a bad idea for you. You're going to not want to do that. Talk to your doctor about testing your MTHFR mutation to see if you have it so that you know whether or not avoiding folic acid is the right idea, because there's plenty of supplemental folates. Again, that methylfolate would definitely be a better option for you supplementally. You would need to take it, because of that, if you were going to continue using that kind of medication, but you just need to be aware. So there are many drugs that interfere with folate. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, there are diseases that cause or contribute to folate deficiency, predominantly celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, gastritis are common reasons why a person might have predisposition to developing a folate deficiency. So, all that being said, that's part of the mechanism of how folate deficit contributes to problems. Now, I want to show you, this is a recent meta-analysis that was done looking at a lot of folate studies. In this particular analyses, they looked at over 100 studies and meta-analysis of folate on disease. And so this was the conclusion that they came to here. Beneficial effects of folate were observed in the all-cause mortality rate and in a number of chronic diseases, including severe birth and pregnancy outcomes, several cancers, cardiovascular disease, as well as metabolic-related outcomes and neurological conditions. Current evidence allows for the conclusion that folate is associated with decreased risk of all-cause mortality and a wide range of chronic disease. So again, very important vitamin. You don't want to be deficient in folate for any length of time for a number of reasons. Those were listed there, were pretty clear. Okay, so additional symptoms of folate deficiency, we've got fatigue, and this is largely because of what we spoke about earlier, and I'll define this a little bit better for you here in just a minute. But anemia, right? Anemias lead to fatigue. They also lead to headaches. They can also cause muscle weakness and muscle pain. Anemias can also cause heart palpitations. We also know folate deficiency associated with weight loss. This has to do with damage to your GI tract. Remember, as I said earlier, you need folate to properly upregulate or maintain the health of the cells of the GI tract. We get the same thing with loss of appetite and dizziness. This is another one associated with, with anemia as well. as well as shortness of breath. So a lot of these are linked back to folate-induced anemia. And so let's kind of spell that out so you can see the mechanism there and understand it a little bit better. So in this study, this was a diagram. This is published in Antioxidants and Redox Signaling, Red Blood Cell Function and Dysfunction, Redox Regulation, Nitric Oxide Metabolism, and Anemia. So what I'm really trying to show you here is in this bone, you have a process called erythropoiesis whereby you're making new red blood cells. So reticulocytes are basically young red blood cells. They're blood cells being produced and they're not quite matured, right? You can see, so that when the red blood cells are born, they're called reticulocytes. And then they go through this process of maturation. Now, this process of maturation, one of the major requirements for it is folate. And if you are folate deficient, you will not see your red blood cells mature properly. You will also see a reduction of the ability to make these reticulocytes, because that's also part of what folate plays, where folate plays a role in red blood cell production. So you get a reduction of maturation, you also get a reduction of maturity and cell replication. And so what happens is you get these very, very large types of cells. Notice how, as this process of maturation goes on, look how large that cell is, and look how large that cell is. But as we go through the cycle, look, they get smaller and smaller. And so a mature red blood cell is small. Generally, this doesn't actually reflect what they look like 100%, but they're little biconcave discs. Let me start that over, Mel. They're little biconcave discs that have hemoglobin protein in them, and this is how they carry oxygen. That oxygen binds to the concavity in that red blood cell. So again, if we're trying to understand the nature of this, these mature red blood cells are smaller. These large red blood cells are not quite mature, and so when we have an immature red blood cell, what's going to happen on your blood work, on your regular lab work, is you're going to have an elevation in something called MCV, mean corpuscular volume. So when you go to your doctor and you get your physicals and your blood work drawn, this is a very common marker found on a blood count, or on what's called a CBC, a complete blood count test. Well, MCV typically is represented as one of the markers on that test, and what an MCV is it's measuring the size of the red blood cell. And so if you have a large red blood cell, the MCV will be high, indicating you're stuck here. And this is what's oftentimes referred to as macrocytic anemia or megaloblastic anemia. So you've got, again, a red blood cell that's not maturing fully because of folate deficiency. Now it's not just folate deficiency. Vitamin B12 deficiency can also do that. And so it's important to understand that folate and B12 generally should be taken together. If you're going to take high doses of B12, you should also consider that you're also getting folate in supplementally, and vice versa. If you're taking high doses of folate, you'd want to consider more vitamin B12. They work in tandem and they work together to help with a lot of these different functions. And so you don't want to, one of the byproducts that can happen is if you're taking high levels of folate for nerve pain, for example, if you have the neuropathy that we were talking about earlier and you're taking folate because you think that's going to fix it, well, high doses of folate will mask a vitamin B12 deficiency. And this is why it's always important to just look at them and take them together so you don't run into this type of problem. Now, that's if you're supplementing on your own. If you're visiting your doctor, it's important that you have these things measured. Have your levels measured. And, you know, most of the time they're going to do what's called a serum analysis, where they're going to look at the serum quantities of your B12 and folate. Serum testing is a little misleading. It's not always super accurate. You get a lot of false negative in that regard. So it's better to look at this from the perspective of intracellular functionality. So measuring intracellularly, so running at what's called an INA, an intracellular nutrition analysis, where you can look at these nutrients to see whether or not you are deficient in them. So again, keep that in mind.